All right, so get this. Imagine a world where Putin's, like, unbreakable grip on power is suddenly challenged, and not by some foreign enemy,
Right.
but by, like, his own hand-picked attack dog.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened back in June of 2023 when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, launched a full-blown mutiny
Yeah.
that sent shockwaves through Russia and the world. And today we're going to be diving deep into all the sources that you provided us to unpack this dramatic event.
Yeah.
So was this just a desperate gamble by Prigozhin, or was it like a calculated power play?
Right.
And what does it mean for the future of Russia?
Well, what's so fascinating about this whole situation is that it really throws a wrench into our understanding of how power works in Russia.
Right.
We tend to think of Putin as this all-powerful figure, the ultimate decision maker.
Right.
But the mutiny exposed a much more complex reality.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a guy nicknamed Putin's chef who
Right.
went from catering state dinners to leading a private army of mercenaries.
Yeah.
And then he turns this army against Putin himself.
Crazy.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does. It really does. The Wagner Group itself is a key piece of this puzzle.
Okay.
You have to understand, it's not just some ragtag band of soldiers.
Right.
It's a highly organized and well-funded private military company with a global reach.
Wow.
They've been involved in conflicts from Syria to Ukraine, often acting as a shadowy extension of Russian foreign policy.
So they were basically Putin's go-to guys for getting things done under the radar.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And that's why this mutiny was so significant.
Okay.
It wasn't just some disgruntled general or a fringe political group.
Right.
This was a challenge from within the very system that Putin had created.
Okay, let's break down how this all went down.
Okay.
It's June 23rd, 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And Prigozhin suddenly launches this rebellion.
Right.
What was the trigger? Was this a long time coming, or was there like a specific event that set things off?
The tensions had been building for months. Prigozhin had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of the Russian military leadership, accusing them of incompetence and corruption, particularly in their handling of the war in Ukraine.
So he was calling them out publicly.
He was.
That's pretty bold considering how Putin usually deals with dissent.
He was highly unusual.
Yeah.
And it really highlighted the growing frustration within certain circles of the Russian elite about the way the war was being conducted.
Okay.
There was a sense that the regular army was failing to deliver on Putin's promises.
Right.
And Prigozhin seemed to be capitalizing on that discontent.
So then he decides to take matters into his own hands.
Right. He orders his troops, some 25,000 of them, battle-hardened from fighting in Ukraine, to seize control of Rostov-on-Don, a key strategic city, and the headquarters of Russia's southern military district.
Whoa, this wasn't just some symbolic protest.
Sure.
This was a direct military takeover of a major city.
Exactly. And it happened with stunning speed and efficiency. The Wagner troops moved in, took control of key infrastructure, and essentially paralyzed the city's defenses.
Okay.
It was a clear demonstration of their military prowess and a sign of how vulnerable Russia's security apparatus might actually be.
And where was Putin in all of this? I mean, wouldn't he have gotten wind of this before it all went down? You'd think he'd have some sort of contingency plan for this kind of scenario.
That's what makes this whole episode so perplexing.
Right.
Putin, the master strategist, the man who projects an image of absolute control, was nowhere to be seen for hours during the initial stages of the mutiny.
No way, he just went dark.
It seems that way.
What was going on behind the scenes?
That's one of the big mysteries of this whole event.
Right.
Was he caught off guard? Was there a power struggle going on within the Kremlin? Were elements of the Siloviki, the Russian security services, hesitant to act against Prigozhin?
Hold on, you said Siloviki.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't fluent in Kremlin speak, what exactly does that mean?
The Siloviki are basically the power brokers in Russia. They're the heads of the various security agencies, the military, the intelligence services. They're the ones who really hold the reins of power, and their loyalty is crucial to maintaining Putin's grip on the country.
So the fact that there was even a hint of hesitation on their part to squash this mutiny is a big deal.
It is.
It suggests that maybe, just maybe, Putin's grip on power isn't as ironclad as we thought.
That's one interpretation.
Okay.
Another possibility is that Putin deliberately chose to let the situation play out for a while. Perhaps to gauge the level of support for Prigozhin.
Okay.
To see who would side with the mutineers and who would remain loyal to him.
Ooh, so it was all a calculated move by Putin?
Maybe.
Like he was playing 4D chess while the rest of us were trying to figure out checkers?
Could be.
Wow.
But Regardless of Putin's intentions, the fact remains that his authority was challenged in a way that we haven't seen in decades.
Right.
And that's a game changer no matter how you spin it.
This is getting juicy. Okay, so Prigozhin's troops have taken Rostov-on-Don. The Siloviki are either paralyzed or playing a deeper game,
Yeah.
and Putin's MIA.
Mhm.
What happens next?
Right.
Do Prigozhin's forces just waltz into Moscow?
That was the fear. Prigozhin made it clear that his target was the Russian military leadership, who he accused of betraying the country and botching the war in Ukraine. His troops started marching north, heading directly for Moscow, the heart of Putin's power.
It sounds like things were about to get really messy really fast. Talk about high stakes.
It was a tense moment. The world was watching, holding its breath, wondering if Russia was about to descend into chaos.
Okay, so we've got Prigozhin and his Wagner forces marching on Moscow, and the world is watching, waiting to see what Putin's next move will be. And then after hours of silence, he finally addresses the nation.
Yeah.
What was the vibe? Was it fire and brimstone, or more like a desperate plea for calm?
It was definitely not the Putin we're used to seeing. He was visibly angry, even rattled. He called Prigozhin a traitor and accused him of stabbing Russia in the back. But what was really striking was the sense of urgency, almost panic, in his voice.
Really?
This was not the calm, calculated leader who had cultivated an image of strength and stability for decades.
Wow. So even Putin seemed to be caught off guard by this whole thing. It really makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes in the Kremlin. Were there frantic phone calls being made, secret deals being struck?
We can only speculate, but one thing's for sure.
Yeah.
Putin's initial silence and then his uncharacteristically emotional response revealed a vulnerability that his opponents, both within Russia and internationally, were quick to seize on.
You mentioned Putin's opponents within Russia. That's something I wanted to dig into a bit more.
Okay.
We know Prigozhin had his grievances with the military leadership, but was there wider support for his actions? Were there other factions within the Russian elite who were sympathetic to his cause?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the power dynamics within Russia. While it's difficult to say for certain how much support Prigozhin had within the elite, there's no doubt that the mutiny exposed pre-existing divisions and rivalries within the system. Remember, Putin has been in power for over 2 decades.
Right.
That's a long time for resentment to build up,
Yeah.
for alternative power centers to emerge.
So even before the mutiny, there were cracks in the facade of unity that Putin had so carefully constructed.
Absolutely. And the mutiny brought those cracks into the open. It forced people to choose sides to declare their loyalties. And that in itself was a major challenge to Putin's authority.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that someone like Prigozhin, who was essentially Putin's creation, could pose such a serious threat to his power. I mean, how did he even amass so much influence in the first place? We talked about the Wagner Group's involvement in various conflicts, but where did they get their funding? How were they structured? Was there any oversight from the Russian government?
The Wagner Group's operations have always been shrouded in secrecy. But over the years, investigative journalists and researchers have been able to piece together a pretty compelling picture.
Okay.
It seems that the group was initially funded by a close ally of Putin's, a businessman named Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Wait.
Yes, the same Prigozhin who led the mutiny.
Oh, wow.
He used his connections within the government to secure lucrative contracts for the Wagner Group, often in countries where Russia had strategic interests.
So it was kind of like a private military company operating under the guise of a catering business.
Exactly. And this arrangement allowed the Russian government to maintain a degree of plausible deniability when it came to the Wagner Group's activities. They could claim that they had no direct control over the group's actions, even though it was clear that they were operating in alignment with Russian foreign policy objectives.
It's a clever way to exert influence without getting your hands dirty, but it also seems like it could create a lot of potential for things to go wrong, as we saw with the mutiny.
Absolutely. By giving Prigozhin so much autonomy and power, Putin essentially created a Frankenstein's monster. He allowed the Wagner Group to become a force unto itself, answerable only to its own leadership. And when Prigozhin decided to turn against his creator, the consequences were almost catastrophic.
Okay, so back to the mutiny in progress. Prigozhin's given his fiery speech, his troops are on the move, and Putin's finally broken his silence. What's the next twist in this crazy story?
Or just as it seemed like the situation was spiraling out of control, a deal was brokered. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, a close ally of Putin, stepped in to mediate between the two sides.
Wait, so the guy who's been called Europe's last dictator is the one who saves the day? Talk about irony.
It was a strange turn of events, but somehow Lukashenko managed to persuade Prigozhin to call off his march on Moscow. The details of the deal are still somewhat murky,
Okay.
but it seems that Prigozhin agreed to go into exile in Belarus in exchange for a guarantee of safety for himself and his troops.
So Prigozhin just packs his bags and heads off to Belarus, just like that.
Yeah.
What about his troops? What happened to them?
They were given the option to either join the regular Russian army, sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, or return to their bases. There were reports of some Wagner fighters relocating to Belarus, but the majority seem to have been integrated into the Russian military.
Wow. So after all that drama and bloodshed, the mutiny just sort of fizzles out. I bet there were a lot of people in Moscow breathing a sigh of relief. But I can't imagine Putin was too happy about having to negotiate with a guy who had just tried to overthrow him.
You're right. While the immediate crisis was averted, the damage was done. The mutiny had exposed the fragility of Putin's regime, the limits of his power, and the deep divisions within Russian society.
So even though the tanks never actually rolled into Moscow, the mutiny had a profound impact on the political landscape.
Absolutely. It shattered the illusion of Putin's invincibility, both domestically and internationally. And it raised a whole host of questions about the future of Russia. Would Putin be able to reassert control? Would Prigozhin remain a threat from exile in Belarus? What would become of the Wagner Group? And perhaps most importantly, how would this whole episode affect the course of the war in Ukraine?
So many questions and so many potential consequences to unravel. Before we get into the aftermath of the mutiny and its implications for Russia's future, I want to take a step back and consider the psychological impact of this event on Putin himself. I mean, this was a guy who had been in control for so long, who had carefully cultivated an image of strength and decisiveness. How do you think this whole experience affected him? Did it shake his confidence? Did it change his worldview?
That's a fascinating question, and one that we can only speculate on. But there are a few things to consider. First, the mutiny was a direct challenge to Putin's authority, something he's unlikely to forget or forgive. It exposed his vulnerability in a way that he probably never anticipated.
So you're saying it might have made him more paranoid, more distrustful of those around him?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And it may have also reinforced his belief that the West is actively trying to undermine him and his regime. Remember, Putin has always framed the conflict in Ukraine as a defensive war against NATO expansion and Western aggression. The mutiny, which came at a time when Russia was already facing setbacks on the battlefield, could be seen as further evidence of this perceived threat.
So instead of leading to introspection or a reassessment of his policies, the mutiny might have actually pushed Putin further into a corner, making him more likely to double down on his hardline stance.
That's certainly a possibility, and that could have serious implications not just for Russia, but for the world. A more isolated, more paranoid, and more aggressive Russia is not something anyone wants to see.
We left off talking about how the mutiny might have impacted Putin on a personal level, maybe even pushing him towards a more isolated and aggressive stance.
Right.
But let's shift gears and zoom out to the bigger picture. How did the world react to this whole Prigozhin saga?
Well, the world was definitely paying attention.
For Western governments, it was a fascinating glimpse behind the curtain of Putin's regime.
Uh-huh.
They saw a leader who was not as all-powerful as he projected himself to be.
Right.
A system that was more fragile than it appeared.
Did they see this as an opportunity to, weaken Russia further?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were calls for increased sanctions, more support for Ukraine,
Okay.
and a general toughening of the West's stance towards Russia.
Mm-hmm.
The mutiny was seen as confirmation that Putin's regime was cracking under pressure,
Right.
and many saw it as a chance to hasten its demise.
Okay, so the West saw weakness and smelled blood in the water.
Yeah.
But what about other countries, especially those who have been aligned with Russia? Did the mutiny change their calculations at all?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
The mutiny definitely had some ripple effects in Russia's sphere of influence.
Okay.
Some countries that had been hesitant to criticize Putin openly started to distance themselves, sensing that he might not be the reliable partner they thought he was. So a loss of face on the world stage for Putin.
Definitely. The mutiny tarnished his image, made him look weak and vulnerable.
Right.
And in the world of geopolitics, perception is often reality.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. We touched on this earlier, but I want to dig a little deeper. You mentioned that the Wagner Group was one of Russia's most effective fighting forces.
They were.
How did their sudden withdrawal from the front lines impact the conflict? Did it give Ukraine an advantage?
There's no doubt that the Wagner Group's withdrawal created a vacuum in the Russian war effort.
Right.
They were involved in some of the most intense battles, and their absence was definitely felt.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed Ukrainian forces to make some strategic gains to regain some lost territory.
So a tactical victory for Ukraine, at least in the short term.
Yes, but it's important to remember that the war is far from over.
Right.
The situation is still fluid, and Russia still has significant military capabilities.
Okay, so let's put on our prognostication hats for a minute. What are some of the potential scenarios that could play out in Russia in the wake of the mutiny? You mentioned earlier that Putin might double down on authoritarianism,
Right.
but are there other possibilities? Could this be the beginning of the end for his regime?
It's always tricky to predict the future, especially when it comes to a country as complex as Russia.
Of course.
But there are a few possible scenarios we can explore.
Uh-huh.
One is, as you mentioned, a further tightening of control, a crackdown on any form of dissent, real or perceived.
Uh-huh.
Putin could use the mutiny as justification to purge his opponents, to consolidate his power even further.
So basically using the threat of instability to justify even more authoritarianism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that could lead to a more repressive, more isolated Russia,
Right.
a country that's even more difficult for the West to engage with.
What about like the opposite scenario? Could the mutiny, by exposing Putin's vulnerability, actually embolden his opponents within Russia? Could we see a genuine challenge to his rule from within the system?
It's not impossible. The mutiny showed that Putin is not invincible. It shattered the myth of his absolute control. And that could encourage others who are dissatisfied with his leadership, who see him as a liability to take action.
So we could see a power struggle within the Kremlin, a fight for the soul of Russia.
That's one possibility. And it would be a very dangerous scenario. A power vacuum in a nuclear-armed country is never a good thing.
Okay, so we've got the possibility of more authoritarianism, the possibility of a power struggle within the elite. Are there any other scenarios we should be considering?
Well, there's always the wild card factor.
Right.
The unpredictable events that can change the course of history in an instant.
Yeah.
A sudden economic collapse, a major military setback in Ukraine, even a health crisis.
Right.
Any of these things could tip the scales and lead to a dramatic shift in the power dynamics in Russia.
So the future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. Russia is at a crossroads.
Yeah.
The mutiny was a pivotal event, a turning point that has set in motion a chain of events that we're only just beginning to understand.
And the consequences will be felt far beyond Russia's borders. The world is watching closely, trying to decipher what comes next for this vast and enigmatic country.
This deep dive into the Prigozhin mutiny has been a wild ride. It's amazing how a single event can expose so many layers of complexity, so many hidden power dynamics. But what's really fascinating is that the story is still being written.
Exactly. What we've done today is just a snapshot in time.
Right.
The situation in Russia is constantly evolving, and the future is still very much up for grabs.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but feel like I need to go back and reread all these articles armed with this new understanding of the forces at play. It's like we just peeled back the first layer of the onion, and there's a whole lot more to uncover.
That's the beauty of deep dives like this, isn't it?
It is.
They spark curiosity. They challenge our assumptions, and they leave us wanting to learn more.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what understanding the world is all about.
Thanks for guiding us through this complex and fascinating topic. It's been an enlightening journey.
My pleasure. Until next time, stay curious.